Hey there, welcome back. In this video, we'll be learning about multiband dynamics. By now, I think you understand the concept of the multiband. Basically, you split your signal into frequency bands and then process only those bands that you think could use some help. In this video, we'll be talking about multiband dynamics. Now, you'll remember that the dynamic effects are compressors, limiters, expanders, and gates. This step of the mastering process can really make the most difference between amateur-sounding work and an album that sounds professional. In particular, good application of a quality compressor can smooth the transients and fluctuations, those are the peaks and valleys, in your mix and make it sound fuller, smoother, or just plain louder, which these days is usually a good thing. Mind you, you shouldn't be able to hear it. The effect should be subtle, unless it's your intention, of course, to create a special effect with these tools. This display here gives you a couple useful meters. The level histogram shows you where most of the levels lie. The wider the display, the more time your song spends at this decibel level. Let's have a listen. Most of my song lies in about this area, and I've got quite a bit of headroom here for both compression and loudness maximizing to boost my signal. Let's take a look at the graph on the right of the meter. This shows the compression curve. A straight line like this indicates that there's no compression curve applied. This tool is both a compressor and an expander gate in one, so I can get rid of noise and smooth out my peaks at the same time. Watch your attack and release times. Too fast a release will result in audible distortion. Too slow a release will result in too much compression of softer signals. You can opt for auto smoothing to get a more natural sound. This lets the plugin adjust the attack and release times for you. You don't need a compressor if your sole purpose is to push more levels into your mix. You might just want to use the loudness maximizer for that. You can bring in limiting and expansion as well. This will help you compress your mid-level signals, limit the top edge, and expand the low levels. That's one cool thing about a mastering dynamics plugin. The interface is a little more simple, but you can do all three at the same time. Now, if your mix is pretty hot, you might just want to bring up the softest parts, so you do this with, you guessed it, the expander. Leave the peaks untouched with a ratio of 1:1. Bring up the lows by setting the expander ratio at less than 1. If you're using the expander as a gate, set the ratio high, like 8:1. That'll reduce the signal below the threshold you set. My graphic display gives me a good indication of how the volume is boosted below the threshold when I adjust. If I intend to use the expander as a gate, I'll take it the other way. As you see, the volume gets reduced below the threshold. Let's lower the threshold, otherwise we're going to cut off some important frequencies. Now you can see any signal below about -50 decibels drops out. If you're in a position where you need to use the expander as an uncompressor to expand an overly compressed signal, you can try a threshold of around -20 to 30 to start, and a ratio of 1:1 to 2 with higher ratios providing more uncompression. Generally, you want to use the technique we've done before, overshoot and then adjust until it sounds natural. We can set the compressor, limiter, and gate for each band. If you want consistency across the bands, you can copy and paste them. Just right-click on the mini spectrum and select Copy. Then select the band you want to copy to, right-click and select Paste. Boosting your bass band with compression is the key to getting more bass out of a mix, as opposed to boosting the low end with EQ. It'll sound more professional and consistent than an EQ boost. For general bass compression, you can start with a 4:1 ratio on the compressor, but check out some extremes to understand the difference in sound. Again, overshoot, then bring down the threshold. bringing up the gain until you get the punch you want and a more natural sound. Reference the graphic display as a sanity check and listen, listen, listen. With slower attacks, you'll hear more of the kick drum since it'll pass more unaffected through the compressor. A fast attack time will soften the kick and bring out more of your bass or synth line. By the way, you'll see and hear this term in many options dialog windows on your music software and your plugins, RMS. This acronym stands for root mean square. Basically, it's a way of measuring dynamics. Your software can either listen and respond to peak level or RMS level. RMS is sometimes thought to correspond better to our subjective impression of loudness by taking a time-averaged measure of the level. It tends to measure a little lower than the peak level. What it means for you is that you get a better reading of what your music actually sounds like. Band 2, as I mentioned previously, is where the warmth of your song generally lies. Watch for adding too much muddiness here. You may need to narrow the band a little, setting the bottom end about 300. Set a 2:1 ratio on the compressor, and let's bring down the threshold, and then up with the gain. Adding some upward expansion on this band might also bring out more warmth of the tone. And after all this tweaking, we are well overdue for a listen. Let's just tweak it a little bit more. I'm going to lower the threshold a bit. Adjust the ratio a little. Actually, let's increase the threshold and then drag it back down. And let's have a listen. Okay, I've got a good boost in my levels. It's warmer in the mids, with much less fading out between the hotter and quieter passages, so I think this work really brought out the softer passages of this song. By the way, you can use the global gain setting to apply uniform makeup gain to all the bands. Let's close this video with some general multiband dynamics tips. You can compress pops with the low band, 120 Hz and below, and use a fast attack to capture transient pops. You can control S sounds or sibilants by making adjustments between 3 and 10 kHz. That's band 3 in my interface. Use a ratio of anywhere from 5 to 8. Bring down the threshold just to the point that the peaks of the sibilants are compressed, usually around 2 to 6 decibels with a fast attack. You can add presence to your vocal in the 4 to 8 kHz region with light ratios of 1.5 to 2.5. And you can add some air with the top band or use this band to gate hiss and other noise. If you're trying to get rid of some noise, loop a section of the mix that has the noise, probably during some quieter part where you'll hear it easier. Watch the spectrum analyzer to see where the noise is. Adjust your band so that the segments of the noise are pretty much contained in a couple bands. Then set a high ratio and bring up the threshold of the expander until the noise is affected. Just make sure your threshold's not too high or you'll gate out the quiet sections of your music. It might take some time to get the right balance, but don't get obsessed with cutting out the noise or your mix might get sterile or hollow sounding. And this concludes our video about multiband dynamics. In our next tutorial, we're going to be looking at the loudness maximizer.